2014 Congressional Debates, a presentation of WVIA Public Media. Tonight, candidates from Pennsylvania's 10th Congressional District. Live from the Sordoni Theater at WVIA Studios, our moderator, WVIA FM's Larry Voitko.
Good evening and welcome to the second in our series of debates among the candidates for the U.S. House of Representatives. Tonight, we hear from the three candidates in the 10th District. We have a live audience here in the Sordoni Theater of the WVIA Public Media Studios, and they have been instructed to applaud only at the beginning and conclusion of the debate. The 10th District encompasses a large geography from the Poconos through the northern tier, down along the west branch of the Susquehanna, almost to Harrisburg. Currently, the district is represented by Congressman Tom Marino. This year, he faces two challengers, Democrat Scott Brion and Independent Nick Troiano. Congressman Tom Marino was first elected in 2010. He was born and raised in Lycoming County and began his working life just out of high school in a manufacturing facility. Eventually, Mr. Marino went to college and finished his education with a law degree from the Dickinson School of Law. His political career began as district attorney in Lycoming County. He served as a U.S. attorney before his election to Congress. Mr. Marino and his wife Edie have two children, Chloe and Victor, and reside in Cogan Station just outside of Williamsport. Scott Brion, the Democrat in the race, grew up on the family farm near Liberty, PA. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business and worked as a financial analyst before entering the energy sector, eventually becoming senior vice president for Genscape, a company involved in wholesale energy markets. In 2008, Mr. Brion founded Tioga Resources, a company that acquires and manages real estate, much of which was prospective for Marcellus Shale development. Nick Troiano from Milford, PA, is an independent candidate in this race. He describes himself as a civic entrepreneur. He has worked on a national level to advance reforms to our political system. He earned his master's degree in American government from Georgetown University. In Pike County, he previously ran his own food concession business, wrote for the Pike County Courier, and worked for the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area. WVIA welcomes these candidates as they field questions from our panelists. Laura Lee Jansen. Laura is news editor for the Williamsport Sun-Gazette, where she has worked since 1984. Laura is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force, where she specialized in flight simulation. Dr. Scott Menk is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Bucknell University. He received his PhD in American politics from the Ohio State University. His primary focus is the U.S. Congress, with interrelated interests in institutional change, the electoral connection, and changes in congressional representation. He has published extensively in periodicals such as Journal of Politics, Legislative Studies Quarterly, and Law and Science Review. Beth Brelia is a reporter for the Pocono Record. She covers Pike County, which is in the 10th District, along with part of Monroe County. Now, here is the format for this hour-long debate agreed to by all campaigns. Each candidate will have 1.5 minutes for an opening statement and 2 minutes for a closing statement. Responses to the questions by our panelists will be held to 1 minute. However, at the discretion of the moderator, 30 additional seconds may be allotted to each candidate for rebuttal. All times will be strictly enforced. Well, we move now to the opening statements. Now, earlier this evening, straws were drawn to determine who would go first. And so, Nick Troiano will begin. Mr. Troiano.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you to WVIA and to all those who've taken time to tune in. It's an honor to be here, and I look forward to this evening's conversation. Growing up in Milford, Pennsylvania, I learned the value of stewardship from my parents, who made enormous sacrifices to give me opportunities they never had, and from my community itself, the birthplace of America's conservation movement. But this value is missing in Washington today, where politicians seem to care much more about themselves than us. Because instead of working together to solve big problems and leading our country, they're following their party bosses and they're following their campaign contributors. And those problems are going unsolved. Our nation's debt, for example, will grow by $58 million just by the end of this debate, and simply because our leaders refuse to work together to balance our budget. As co-founder of a national organization focused on reducing our nation's debt, I personally saw how politicians would rather stick the next generation with the bill. Well, Congressman, I'm standing here tonight because I refuse to pick up your tab. You see, Tom Marino, like so many politicians, got elected promising to be different. But then he goes to Washington and votes with his party 94% of the time and takes the vast majority of his money from special interests. We don't need more politicians who promise to be different. We need leaders who are different. That's why I'm not running with a party and refusing all contributions from special interests. I'm running to represent you. Thank you.
Next, Mr. Brion.
Thank you very much, Larry. I'm from Liberty, Pennsylvania. And in Liberty, we cut firewood, we bale hay, we drive trucks. And in Liberty, when somebody has a problem, we come together and we help them out. And nobody ever stops to ask whether you're a Democrat or whether you're a Republican before deciding to help. It's simply a matter of people using common sense, coming together, and solving a problem. And I'm here tonight to tell you that the United States Congress could learn a whole lot from Liberty, Pennsylvania. Today in Washington, every issue is seen as an opportunity for a partisan battle. And many members of Congress seem to behave as if they've forgotten that their primary responsibility is represent the constituents back home and not to represent a political party. I'm running for Congress because I want to change all of that. We deserve a representative who works for us. We need a representative who frames every issue from the perspective of how does this affect rural Pennsylvania. A leader who can apply common sense solutions to solve the problems that affect the lives of the people that we know. Now, generally, I believe that these issues are improving public education, providing services to veterans in rural areas, and to protecting the dignity and the security of our seniors' retirement. And, you know, I believe that our community is best served by a representative who knows us and who knows that rural Pennsylvania is what we represent.
And Mr. Marino, your opening statement.
Thank you. My dad was a firefighter and a janitor, the toughest man I knew. That's where I get my toughness. I worked in a factory from 17 until 30 years old. I swept floors starting out. I know what it's like to live from a paycheck to paycheck and to stretch a buck into next week. I was 21 years old, paying a mortgage, married, and supervising 100 people. I was overlooked for a promotion because I did not have a college degree. So I decided to go to college 2 weeks after my 30th birthday. My wife worked full-time and I worked part-time, and if it wouldn't have been for my wife, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. I was a prosecutor for most of my adult life, a district attorney in Lycoming County and a U.S. attorney for the Middle District of Pennsylvania. I ran for Congress to give my kids a brighter future and to get this country on the right track. In D.C., I will continue to provide the best constituent service for the people in the 10th Congressional District, to fight for term limits, 12 years and you're out, to fight for one subject at a time so you know what we're voting for, and to prevent leaders from stopping legislation from going to the floor for a vote. Harry Reid and the Do-Nothing Democrat Senate are sitting on 387 bills that they refuse to allow to go to the floor to the vote, and some of them are bipartisan. I want to thank you very much, and as a result...
Thank you, Mr. Marino. Well, we move on now to the question and answer portion of the program, and the questions will be delivered to one of the candidates at a time, but each candidate, again, will get a chance to answer each of these questions. So we're going to begin with Laura Lee Jansen from the Williamsport Sun-Gazette, and this first question goes to Mr. Brion.
Good evening, candidates, and thank you for joining us. My first question, I'd like to open with a question about Ebola. Are we handling it correctly? What should we be doing differently?
Great. Thank you. You know, the question of Ebola is one which I think is still emerging. And so I believe that it's really difficult to assess. And I think that the caution and the way that I say that we should approach this problem is, first, we really have to rely on our public health officials. We have people in place specifically to handle the kinds of issues that we can't anticipate how they roll out. And so I think that so far we have made mistakes, but hopefully it looks like we're learning from those mistakes. And we're in some trial and error. Right now there's a huge discussion about whether we should be quarantining people when they return, and what are the long-term effects of that. That's completely appropriate. And so I think so far we have gotten it right. And I am concerned that we've had calls that have been somewhat extreme in some of the reaction, because I think a measured and appropriate and reasonable approach is the best thing to keep America safe.
Thank you, Mr. Brion. Now, the question we go to Congressman Marino.
Thank you. The first thing we need to do concerning Ebola is isolate. The next thing we need to do is temporarily ban commercial visas out of countries where the disease is spreading. That's common sense. When my kids were in kindergarten and first grade, there was a breakout. They told us to keep the kids home so the disease wouldn't spread. We have to check passports and people who jump from country to country. We have to prepare hospitals. That's not being done. We need clear communication from our leaders. Again, that's not being done. They're sending mixed signals. We get misinformation from the czar, from the CDC. He allowed people to travel knowing that they showed the symptoms. We're getting false reassurance from them. The president does not want to put a ban on. And most medical professions, most elected officials, governors across the state think that's the smart thing to do. And that's, I think, exactly what we should be doing.
Thank you. And Mr. Troiano.
Well, it's a good question, and I think Ebola is a serious threat that needs to be taken seriously. But the good news is that there's more candidates on stage talking about it tonight than people who have Ebola in our country. So we need to keep in mind there's not an outbreak in the United States, nor is there one likely. But we need to take all the steps we can to prevent the spread of Ebola to the American people. That's why I think we should step up our screenings at airports. We need to make sure there's a ready response team ready to go, and tightening visa restrictions. But I think we should follow the advice of our medical professionals, not our political professionals. When Congressman Marino released a statement saying that Ebola was spiraling out of control, quote, or quote, that the American people are living under a false sense of security, that unnecessarily contributed to public panic. That's not the kind of responsible leadership we need in Washington. The Congress should be back in session discussing this, discussing the threat to ISIS, and not on vacation to campaign. Thank you.
Thank you. And a rebuttal, Mr. Brion?
Yes, sir, please. I just want to rebut. I think that we've heard some criticisms about we need to isolate, we need to ban visas, we need to check passports. These aren't the things we need to do to stop Ebola. I mean, if we really want to, these are things that may have some short-term effect, but they're not going to make us safer. And so criticizing the system we have now, we'd be better served to solve this problem in Africa. And if we want to really solve it, that's where we need to go and deploy resources immediately.
Any other comments on that?
Yeah.
Yes,
We are deploying resources to Africa. We're not banning medical personnel from going over there. That is going there. It's just common sense. The people in the 10th Congressional District tell me constantly, this scares me. I have a concern about this. We have to do everything we can to prevent it from getting into the United States and spreading. And obviously we have people in the country that are in quarantine. We have people in the country that have the disease. So we don't need to take any chances, and I'm not taking chances on the people in the 10th Congressional District.
Thank you. And Mr. Troiano, do you have
Sure.
anything else?
Well, I think now's not the time to play on those fears by suggesting things that our medical professionals advise against. I think we need to do what's responsible now, but also look to the long term. We shouldn't have supported the sequester cut as the congressman did, which cut funding from the National Institutes of Health, which is still working on trying to find a vaccine. We have to think in the long term and not be reactionary and not play on people's fears.
Well, thank you. And we'll move on now to the next question. And the first to answer this question will be Congressman Marino, and it will come from Dr. Mink.
Congressman Marino, the Supreme Court recently struck down part of the Voting Rights Act that required pre-approval for new election laws in areas with a history of discrimination. In doing so, it called on Congress to revise the law. Would you support legislation to update the pre-approval requirements of the Voting Rights Act?
I don't see anything wrong in the Voting Rights Act for asking for identification. The fraud across the country grows rampant, and more so in Philadelphia. Everyone is entitled to a vote. Everyone has a right to vote. I have to get a photo taken to drive a car. I have to get a photo taken to cash a check. I have to show ID when I go into a hotel. There is nothing wrong with a person who wants to vote, wants to exercise their right, having that photo taken. Now, I've heard in the past it's difficult for these people to do that. No, we will place and have placed offices around the country, around their states, around their cities where they can go get these photos done. It's no cost for them, and I can't believe that most people that are complaining about this are shut in their house. People travel, people get out, and people have ways through transportation to go and have these photos taken, because we need to make sure that there's no fraud in voting as there has been over the year.
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. And Mr. Troiano.
I think the Congress needs to act to make sure that we uphold our fundamental right to vote. That's what our country is built on. And I think in addition to responding to the Supreme Court striking down parts of the Voting Rights Act, we need to make it easier for people to participate in our democracy. For example, in Pennsylvania, it's astounding that we can't register to vote online or have same-day voter registration or early voting like other states. States that have these measures in place have higher rates of participation. And I think that's how we're going to be able to hold our leaders accountable. So if elected in Congress, I would do all I can to make it easier and not harder for people to participate in our democracy.
Thank you. And Mr. Brion.
Yes, I would support such legislation. I think that what we've seen is since the Supreme Court struck down those measures, that we have seen a number of states take action to restrict voting. And we can call it, voter ID, a number of strikes, but the fact of the matter is, we don't have a problem of fraudulent voting in this country, not one that's documented. I believe here in Pennsylvania, I'm not sure, I don't think there's even one case, and if there is a case, it's not more than 10. And so I am a believer in small, effective government, and I believe we should legislate and put government into places where we need it. And I would say if we don't have any documented cases of voter fraud or a need, then I think then clearly calls for limiting people's access to voting have a purpose other than what they should. And so I would also say that it is an opportunity to figure out how do we expand voting. Voting should be easier, and it should be more accessible to more people.
Congressman, any rebuttal to that?
Well, there's been cases in Philadelphia where a woman was prosecuted for having voted several times under different names, and there was a case where a person used the same name and went to several different voting booths right here in Pennsylvania.
All right. Any other comments?
I would say that two cases, and just real quickly, I would say that two cases do not require they require us to put laws into place that would hinder and keep thousands of people from voting.
Any other comments, Mr. Troiano? All right. Well, let's move on to the next question. And this is coming from Beth Bralia, and she will be first addressing this question to Mr. Troiano.
The implementation of the Affordable Care Act has not gone smoothly, most people agree. In the next Congress, would you push for repeal, refinement, or improvements? Where do you stand on health care?
Thank you, Beth. Well, I opposed the Affordable Care Act as it was going through Congress, but now it's the law. And I think we need to acknowledge where it is working in terms of extending insurance to people who didn't have access, and overhaul the law where we know it's failing us. And I've heard from many of you where it's failing us. It's costing our country too much. It's creating too much uncertainty for our businesses who want to hire more people. It's costing families who had plans that they liked higher out-of-pocket costs. So that's where my health care plan that I've laid out first calls on Congress to replace the individual and employer mandates with market-based incentives for people to gain coverage. And second, would scale back the size and scope of federal subsidies. But we need to do more, and both parties need to work together because we spend more than the average of other countries on health care, yet get below average results. We need to improve a delivery system to reward doctors and providers based on the quality of their services and not just the quantity. And that's where my focus would be in Congress.
Thank you. Mr. Brion.
Yeah, I will tell you, I can provide testament to the difficulties of working through the website. My family's coverage is through the ACA. And what I would tell you today, my experience has been very positive. I've got a much better insurance than I had a year ago, and we're looking at a situation now. I think premiums are only supposed to increase minimally, if not go down next year. And so there certainly are some successes. And beyond my personal success, we're at a situation where today in America, if you get sick and you lose your job, you can get insurance. And this time last year, that wasn't the case. Not insurance you can afford. And so I think we have to build on the success of the ACA. It's law. Clearly, there are things to improve, not only in the way we interact with the exchanges, but also the next phase and how we roll in and how we ultimately tackle the real problem, which is reducing the cost of health care in America.
Thank you. Congressman.
Well, Mr. Troiano says now that he opposes the Affordable Care Act, but he voted for President Obama. He voted for what he stood for. The Health Care Act is a disaster. I'm getting more and more calls from my constituents across the 10th Congressional District. They're losing their insurance. Their rate's going up. It's doubling. It's tripling. They're having trouble get their medications. The Republicans have a plan, and it's a good plan. But my opponents criticize, saying that we don't have a plan. Obviously, they're not doing their homework, kind of like Nancy Pelosi doesn't do her homework. What the plan does is it fully repeals Obamacare. Obamacare is destroying jobs in this country. It spurs competition to go across state lines to buy insurance. So we have competition there, and insurance rates will go down. We can get a tax deduction for health costs. Citizens can make sure that we have good malpractice, no tort reform. It's not in Obamacare. There is no malpractice tort reform in Obamacare. That's one of the biggest problems that we have.
Thank you, Congressman. Rebuttal, Mr. Troiano.
Sure. Well, I want to set the record straight because I know the Congressman will bring this up several times tonight. I voted for the President in 2008 because I thought he was in the best position to transcend partisan politics and solve problems. He failed. I voted against President Obama in 2012. The bottom line is I make my decisions not on party lines, but what I think is in the best interest of the country. And what's in the best interest of our district isn't voting over 50 times to repeal the law. That won't help the 70,000 people without health insurance in our district. I'd work with the other party and solve this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Troiano. And Mr. Brion.
I'd like to point out to Mr. Marino that repealing Obamacare, allowing insurance to be bought across state lines, and giving tax deductions is not a health care plan. It's in no way comparable. That plan would not address the very fundamental issue that I talked about in my first response, pre-existing conditions. So I just want to really point out that repealing the Obamacare does not solve the problem. We need to expand the coverage of health insurance.
And Congressman, you'll have the last word on this issue if you'd like.
Well, the people in the 10th Congressional District do not want Obamacare. Repealing it is the answer, putting in the Republicans' plan, because there are still people out there, many people, that are losing their insurance. And that's what's important, that we keep insurance and we keep it affordable. That's what the Republican plan does. It's simple, it's common sense, it's affordable.
All right, well, let's move on to the next round of questions. And the question here will be directed first to Mr. Brion and will come from Dr. Mink.
Mr. Brion, the current Congress has faced several important questions about the use of military force. The next Congress will face more of the same issues, as several members of both parties have asked for a vote on the use of force against ISIS. Is this an issue that Congress needs to take up? And if so, would you vote to support the use of force?
Well, absolutely, it's an issue that Congress needs to take up, and I think it's shameful that Congress hasn't already taken it up. I don't know what could be more of an important issue than authorizing the use of military force. I believe now we're operating in Syria and in Iraq based on an AUMF from 2001. And I really question the fact that Congress has had time to deal with a number of very trivial issues. They've bundled up a number of bills, which the House bundled up a number of bills which had already been passed, and they found that to be more important than debating the very serious issue. As to whether I think it should be authorized, I believe we need to have that very serious debate. I think right now there is a serious and credible threat, and we need to put a plan in place in which we can address that threat, and that would require an authorization. And barring, I guess, with a full debate, then I think that's a reasonable move.
Mr. Marino.
The system works where the President is the commander-in-chief. He is the one that sends a request to Congress asking for the funds to use force. The president said he really didn't need Congress. He will use force. He has his pen and his phone, and he's done that. It's not the Congress's responsibility to go to the president and say, this is what you must do militarily. He is the commander-in-chief. We can make suggestions to him once he sends us a request that he has. The president hasn't done that. The only thing he has done thus far is to ask for funds to be reshifted to use concerning ISIS. And we voted on that. And most of us did support that and send it back to him. But he has yet to ask us to come up with a solution. He hasn't, and we're waiting for him to do his job as the commander-in-chief.
Mr. Troiano.
Well, I think the executive branch has, over time, overstepped its authority in terms of military engagements, and the Congress needs to be more involved, and especially on the growing threat of ISIS. Now, on that particular issue, I don't support putting American boots on the ground right now, but I think it's a strategic misstep to take it off the table. I think right now our focus needs to be on putting greater pressure on our partners in the region, including Turkey and the Gulf states, so that our airstrikes ongoing can be more effective, and to greater use our special forces there for counterterrorism operations. Furthermore, we need to realize that there's not going to be a long-term solution in battling ISIS without a political component. We need a transfer of power out of the Assad regime in Syria. We need a government in Iraq that can have the confidence of the various sectarian factions, so that when we do defeat ISIS, another radical terrorist group doesn't fill its shoes. And that's a lesson that I think we need to learn from our past engagements, and the Congress should take forward.
We'll move on to a rebuttal here, and Mr. Brion, you.
Yeah, I want to, in regarding a debate and a discussion about the AUMF, Mr. Marino, you have been very free criticizing this president at every opportunity. I don't know why Congress has not criticized the president in this regard and specifically called for hearings and asked for that. I just think that it is Congress's responsibility to rein in the executive in this area, and so that if we are working off an AUMF that is 14 years old, it's your responsibility and Congress' responsibility to pull the take the executive to task.
We consistently take the executive to task, anywhere from Obamacare and to military issues. Concerning his performance with ISIS, he had 2 opportunities to take them out. He failed. Remember, he said it was a JV team. What I don't want to see is American troops on the front line fighting ISIS at this point. What we can do is step up the air strikes. We have massive air equipment that we can go in and take these people out. We need more intel, and we need our special ops to train and direct.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Troiano?
Sure. Well, I think we should acknowledge that we might not be having this conversation if our leaders acted in our long-term national interest and not their short-term political interest. Our congressman stood with Barack Obama in refusing to engage and support the moderate opposition in Syria when we had the opportunity and our military leaders were advising us to do so. And we shouldn't have withdrawn our troops from Iraq. Again, these are lessons that I think we need to learn going forward. And coming out with a 7-point plan now, Congressman, is a bit too late.
All right, let's move on. And Beth Brelia will ask the next question, and it will first be directed to Congressman Marino.
Many Pennsylvanians are concerned about the impact that the natural gas fracking and pipeline industry has on the environment. What federal policies would assure that the air, water, soil, and natural vistas are protected?
The traditional federal policies are still in place. They're not taken out of place. We have not only the EPA watching over this, but we have the DEP watching over this. The opportunity with energy is so great here. It's creating jobs. We do it cleaner than anyone else in the world. We should be utilizing this. It's in Bradford County and Lycoming County. Millions of dollars has been brought into those areas. Thousands of jobs have been created because of this. There has not been not one factual and scientifically proven issue that says fracking contaminates water, contaminates the air. I'll be the first one to stand in place and say shut it down if that's the case. I ask people about it all the time, and they'll say, well, I heard this. Well, get me the facts. I'm not given the facts. In fact, the president's EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, said we should, the rest of the country should be drilling for gas, just like Pennsylvania's doing it.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Troiano.
Sure. I support the development of our natural gas in our region. I think it's good for our economy and the jobs that it's creating, including to a company I visited just a few weeks ago that now exists because it's treating and recycling the wastewater. It's also good for our country because it's lessening our dependence on foreign sources of fossil fuels, and it's good for our environment because it's cleaner than other sources, and it's going to help us transition to where we need to go, an economy based on clean and renewable sources of energy. In Congress, I'd work to make sure that it's done in an environmentally safe and economically sustainable way. I'd require, for example, or I'd pressure requirement of the disclosure of the chemicals that are used in the hydraulic fracturing process, and also require that a cement bond log be submitted to a government agency to ensure the structural integrity of our wells. But we need an independent advocate there. The congressman's taken over $20,000 from 6 different natural gas companies in our district. We know whose side he's on. I want to be on your side.
And Mr. Brion.
Yeah, I think, largely the environmental oversight and regulation of natural gas is a state's issue in the way that we're currently structured. But I do think that, to speak directly to your question, I think the EPA has a really critical role. And I think the EPA is sort of the backstop, if you would say. So the EPA at one point did actually come into Pennsylvania and study some specific issues that were happening, and they came to the conclusion that the DEP here in Pennsylvania were handling those properly. So I think the area where we really want to look at is we really want to look at how do the EPA interact with some of these various state agencies to make sure that we are enforcing guidelines properly. And then also, this is a very new process. So, it's very reasonable to say we should be reviewing and looking at all the environmental impacts for that industry.
Congressman, you have a rebuttal?
Yeah, I do have a rebuttal on the issue because Mr. Troiano keeps whining about where I get my money from. Well, he fails to tell you that he ran in Washington a dark money super PAC, which didn't have to report where they got their money. And I get my money most of it from the people right here in Pennsylvania, and the rest of my money, those people are represented by individuals and groups in Washington like plumbers and construction builders. And they decided to give the money to me because I'm a conservative individual, and that's what the 10th wants.
Thank you, Congressman. Mr. Troiano.
Well, that's not true. I have more of my campaign funding coming from people in our district than does the congressman. In fact, since the congressman was elected, he's accepted over $1 million in special interest PAC money. And when we did an analysis of this in July, we found that more than half of it came from corporations or other groups that would directly stand to benefit from the legislation he's put forward or from his committee assignments. Today, we have a system of legalized bribery, and I want to go to Washington to end it.
Mr. Brion.
If anybody remembers the question, we're talking about the environmental impact.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want my 3 seconds back for the laugh. But really, we're talking about the environmental impact of natural gas development. And I think it's shameful that that's not what we're talking about. Do we realize in the 10th District, we produce 10% of the natural gas produced in the United States of America. And 5 years ago, that was 0. This is a really big, important issue, and I think it's really important that we stay on topic and we talk about the issues. And to be honest, if we can't get along, if we're going to bicker on stage, how are we going to serve in Congress?
All right, let's move on because I think that we're not going to get any further on that issue. So the next question will come from Laura Lee Jansen, and she will be addressing first this question to Mr. Troiano.
After Hurricane Katrina, Congress passed the federal Biggert Waters Flood Act. One of the impacts of that is that a lot of Pennsylvanians, north central Pennsylvanians, are struggling with skyrocketing flood insurance rates, and it's causing their property values to go down. What can be done to alleviate the situation at this point?
This is a very important issue, so thanks for the question, Laura. Many of our river towns and communities are being affected by the Biggert Waters Act, which the congressman voted for without reading it, which on the first page of it said and laid out the rate increases that would come down to them. I think that's unacceptable. And what Congress has done so far is simply kick the can down the road on the provisions coming into play. If elected, I would work to reform the Biggert Waters bill and the National Flood Insurance Program. First, on slowing any rate increases. Second, on not putting the debt in the NFIP solely on the backs of the people who had these insurance policies through no fault of their own. And third, provide greater resources for our communities to engage in greater mitigation against flooding in the future. Again, this is an issue that, because the congressman votes 94% of the time with his party, he voted not in the interest of our community. And I'd like to change that.
The next up is Mr. Brion.
Yes. So the actual, how do we fix Biggert Waters? This is a really important issue because I believe that I would even go beyond the premise of your question. I think there are families who are in a position to lose their homes because the impact of these increase in flood insurance is going to be so dramatic. The really interesting part about this is if you look at most communities and areas in Pennsylvania, we have never received more back in claims than we pay into the system in insurance. So in reality, there's this idea that somehow this flood insurance reform actually stabilized and stopped flood insurance rates from being subsidized. But in reality, here in Pennsylvania, we've been subsidizing other parts of the country. So I think a part of that answer is going to rely on how we have regional risk pools, whereby the true risk of claims payouts are what are based on our premiums here locally. And I think when you see that, you're going to see those rates to go down to low, reasonable, perhaps even before pre-Biggert Waters insurance rates.
Congressman.
I did read Biggert Waters, and it said the insurance rates would not go up more than 5 or 10%, 10% on the commercial side of things. And matter of fact, FEMA testified to that before in a hearing. But unfortunately, they weren't telling us the truth. More than 405 of the House members, Republicans and Democrats, voted for Biggert Waters out of the 435 seats that are in Congress. They voted based on the information we were given. I saw firsthand the damage that people receive. I saw them when they were children, didn't have a room to sleep in. What I did, I was on the ground. I was right there on the front line with these people the 2 weeks during that flood. I worked closely with FEMA, getting water to them, getting food to them, and making arrangements for them to have something to live in while their house was being repaired. But the bottom line is we must repeal Biggert Waters. That's the only way we're going to reserve our tax base and keep the value of our houses. Repeal Biggert Waters, and I dropped that legislation.
All right, we'll have rebuttals on this. Mr. Troiano.
Sure. Well, I think we need to go beyond repealing Biggert Waters because our national flood insurance is still over $20 billion in debt. And it's going to require some cooperation between both sides. I think we should set up a blue ribbon commission of experts in the industry to propose an alternative. And as Mr. Brion said, perhaps that's regionalizing it. Perhaps that's putting flood insurance at a state level. More options need to be on the table. But we need to do more than just kick the can down the road, which this Congress has gotten awfully adept at.
Mr. Brion.
Yeah, and I would say that what I would like to see is a real concrete plan moving forward. To me, I've not seen any activity in Congress. I know you did, the Congressman Marino did introduce a bill which had 0 co-sponsors and went went nowhere. And so I don't think that so if there's some move to repeal Biggert Waters afoot, I'd be very pleased for the Congressman to tell us about it and tell us what the policy that he proposes that we replace it with.
Congressman.
The policy is going back to where we were. People didn't realize that the government did subsidize the flood insurance. And we're saying to these people that, okay, we don't need the rivers anymore to move our goods and to move people up and down the rivers and the streams. We can't do that. What we need to do is repeal Biggert Waters, because if we don't repeal it, those values of those houses will be practically 0. What that does to the tax base in the county is extraordinary. It's not right. That's our first biggest asset.
Thank you, Congressman. And Beth Brelia will be asking Mr. Brion this question first.
The Highway Trust Fund bill that President Obama signed into law recently is only a short-term solution to the long-term problem of funding the highway and bridge repairs. What measures would you support to establish a sustainable response to the issue?
Well, in general, I tend to believe that we should look historically, what is this government good at? What has the federal government done that's been successful? And a large part of that is we made investments. We've made investments in our infrastructure and in education. And I think really when you look at highways and the transportation, which is a big part, highway funding and construction is a big part of that transportation trust fund issue. And so, I tend to believe that we need to come up with a long-term plan, and then we need to prioritize the funding. It's simply a matter of priorities. We've got people in Congress who are willing to spend whatever it takes to build a fence on our southern border, but not necessarily build a highway in central Pennsylvania. And for me, it's a matter of prioritization. I think we really need to focus on, how do we put those funds in good areas that are going to invest and have a payback that are going to help us build our economy, grow revenues, and pay for themselves in the long run.
Thank you. And Congressman.
Concerning the Highway Trust Fund and the federal government and President Obama, what he could have done is use the stimulus money to build our infrastructure, to rebuild our infrastructure, our roads and our bridges. He didn't do that. He used that for social programs. He was supposed to have shovel-ready jobs concerning the stimulus. Didn't apply any of that. So now the states are burdened with it. In fact, the governor of our state is taking the steps to repair the roads, the bridges. He's cutting frivolous spending in other areas, what this administration should do. We have so much frivolous spending, so much fraud going on in D.C., and then this administration for the last 6 years didn't pay any attention to the Highway Trust Fund. That's unconscionable for this president.
Mr. Troiano.
Well, we saw this problem coming because the dedicated revenues to the Highway Trust Fund weren't indexed to inflation and haven't been raised in, I think, over 20 years. So that's something that the Congress needs to reconsider. But it's just a symptom of a larger problem, that we're living beyond our means at the next generation's expense and not solving the problems before us. As co-founder of a national organization that was focused on reducing our debt and fixing our budget, I helped draft and get introduced in both houses of Congress a bipartisan piece of legislation called the Inform Act, which would finally require the government to disclose its off-balance sheet obligations and liabilities, which would include our infrastructure that we're not investing in, and the Highway Trust Fund. That's why, if I'm elected, I'm going to work on trying to shepherd that piece of legislation, which has been endorsed by over 1,000 economists, through to passage. And I think it's a demonstration of how I've been able to bring good people around good ideas, and I'd like to do that around other issues, including the Highway Trust Fund.
Thank you. Rebuttal, Mr. Brion.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to, I guess, follow up what the congressman had talked about. This question is, how do we solve this issue going forward? What do we think it is? The congressman is talking about the spending of stimulus funds by President Obama. And I could sit up here and argue with him about that, but the fact of the matter is we need to begin focusing on the forward policy, not what somebody did not 4 years ago, not what somebody did 2 years ago, because there's only one of us on this stage who's been in office 4 years who could have done anything about it. And what the real is going to benefit the voters of the 10th District, we talk about what we're going to do next year.
Thank you. Congressman.
We have tried to make the changes in Washington that are necessary. As a matter of fact, we voted 387 times with bipartisan legislation that passed the House and went over to the Senate. It's sitting on Harry Reid's desk. There's job creation in there. There's money to fix the roads. There's money to fix the bridges. There are plans in there to create jobs for the federal government to get out of the way of private industry that can take these issues on. So he can't sit there and say we haven't done anything.
Mr. Troiano.
Well, there he goes blaming Harry Reid again. You know, in the course of this campaign, I've heard Congressman Marino blame Harry Reid for just about everything except back pain and hair loss. It's time that he takes responsibility. It's not new what's going on in Washington as far as the Senate. I looked back over the last 20 sessions, and at the end of a majority of them, the Senate was sitting on more than 300 bills from the House. It's not right. But it's nothing new. What is new is that we have the most partisan and least productive Congress in our lifetime, the House of Representatives. And that's what we need to focus on changing by getting new leadership there.
Thank you, Mr. Troiano. Ms. Jansen, you will ask the next question, and it will first be directed to the congressman.
What will you do to save Social Security for the millions of Americans who rely on it now and into the future, particularly those with lower incomes and no pensions and who are not able to save significant amounts?
Medicare and Social Security are the two biggest problems we are faced with. The Republicans have worked on and have a good plan to preserve Medicare and working on a good plan to preserve Social Security. My opponents want to raise the age in Social Security. We cannot do that. I worked in a factory. He hasn't worked in a factory. I know what it's like to get calluses on your hands. We can't ask people who are in a factory, 60-some years old, or who are working in a mine, or are lugging big trays of food around and dishes, to say, you have to work longer. So I do not agree to raising that age requirement. What we have to do is create jobs. When we create jobs in this country, like we can with the energy that we have in this country, the gas, the oil, the coal, what are those people going to do? There are 20 million people out of work. Just think if we got half of those people working, collecting a good pay and paying taxes, that's what's going to help fund Medicare and make it solvent.
Thank you. Mr. Troiano.
Well, on the topic of Social Security, I think it's a vitally important program that provides retirement security for millions of Americans. I brought my grandma as a guest tonight. She's one of the half of single seniors who rely on Social Security for more than 90% of her income. And that's why I think it's crucially important we take steps now to ensure that we keep our promises to today's seniors and make sure this program is solvent for future seniors too. I am the only candidate on this stage with a plan to make Social Security solvent for the next 75 years. We can close 85% of our funding shortfall by doing three things: improving the measure of inflation in the program, raising the retirement age by 2 years over the next 20 years with a hardship exemption and leaving early retirement at 62, and by raising the cap on taxable wages from $117,000 to $217,000. The worst thing that we can do to ensure the solvency of Social Security is nothing. And because of the gridlock in Washington, that's exactly what we're doing today.
Thank you. And Mr. Brion.
Great. I think the first thing is, I wanted to, your question, you said save Social Security. And I guess what I want to point out is I would disagree with the congressman. I don't see Social Security as one of the two biggest problems that we face. There are issues with Social Security, but Social Security we're solvent to make our current payments and obligations for 20 years. There's $2.7 trillion in the Social Security Trust Fund. As a businessman, coming from a business perspective, this is a problem we can solve. I think the congressman was right when he said a big part of that is let's increase employment. Let's grow the economy. We really need to focus on that. The more people paying into that system, automatically the longer it gets passed out. I do want to kind of clarify one thing. Improving the measure of inflation. That is actually lowering payments. That's lowering the amount that it's increased. And I think if you're talking about chain CPI, which is in your program, that would reduce benefits over a 30-year period by almost $28,000. That's cutting Social Security, and that's not the answer.
Thank you. I know this is a big issue. We probably could spend the rest of the time on this, but time is short, and we really should move on to the next.
Could I do a rebuttal?
We just don't have the time, Congressman. We'll move on, and Dr. Menk will be addressing this question first to Mr. Troiano.
Mr. Troiano, can you explain one specific thing that you think the federal government does well, and what lessons we can take from this success for how we should approach other federal policies?
Well, I think some targeted investment is something that the federal government has proved success at in the past. Whether it was DARPA, which helped create the internet, or GPS or the Human Genome Project, there are specific ways and targeted ways that federal investment has contributed to economic growth. And that is why, even though we have $18 trillion in debt, and that's the issue that got me involved in politics and wanting to run, and yes, we do need to restrain government spending, we should protect the kind of investments that will help grow our economy and will help keep us competitive globally. And the wrong approach to take here are the across-the-board cuts of the budget sequester, which the congressman voted for, which didn't discriminate about what's investments in the future and what are low-priority, wasteful spending that's occurring today. I am a champion of the proposals of the bipartisan Simpson-Bowles Commission, and I'm honored to have both of their support in my campaign. That's the kind of approach I'd take to fixing our budget.
Thank you. And Mr. Brion.
Yeah, I would have to echo that I think that you historically look at what are the things that the government have done and what are the examples that we've done well. GI Bill. All kinds of examples of investment, be that in education or be that in hard research and development. I do think that that is something that we need to be very mindful. This is a time when, we all want to be prudent, and we certainly, although I think our national debt is within a manageable range, we certainly don't want it to get higher, and we want to, over time, make it lower. And I think one of the ways that you do that is you really look at all expenditures from a lens of, is this an investment or is this spending? And we really need to, again, get back to this prioritization where we're making good investments instead of just spending. And so that would, relate to infrastructure investments, research and development, investments in healthcare and medicine, and the primary research which will lower our costs in healthcare, because I would say Medicare is a very serious cost issue which we do face.
Thank you. And Mr. Marino.
The government does a good job, a great job, the best in the world of protecting American citizens. The government is protecting our veterans, with the exception of what was done at the Veterans Administration. The government needs to get out of the way. The states, it needs to get out of the way of private industry. Let private industry do what it does best.
Well, thank you. Yes, Mr. Troiano.
Sure. Well, I agree with the congressman. We ought to have a smaller government. It ought to be downsized. But as he's been in Congress, he supported legislation, for example, the SOPA bill, which would have the government start regulating the internet. He authored legislation that would have the government start monitoring what Americans purchase at the supermarket. And he rubber-stamped the NSA's bulk collection of our email and cell phone data. That isn't about downsizing government. That's about downsizing our liberty. And if elected, I want to be an advocate for our civil liberties and our Constitution.
Mr. Brion, any other further comments?
Yeah, real quickly, I would just disagree that right now I don't think we're doing an adequate job protecting our veterans. And I think that's particularly an important issue in the 10th Congressional District. We're 20%, we have 20% more veterans than the national average as a percentage of your population. And, there's a person I rode the school bus with back from Liberty. He's a neighbor of Mr. Marino's. He has to go 2 hours to go to Wilkes-Barre to go to some of his doctor's appointments. He's a combat wounded veteran. That's 4 hours round trip. His wife has to take time off work to take him there. That's not taking care of your veterans. We have to do better.
Congressman.
I took care of my veterans because I opened up a veterans hospital in Wayne County, so veterans don't have to travel several hours. We're trying to open another one, so that's already accomplished. So apparently my opponent over there didn't check on that. SOPA and the NSA and food stamps. My opponent's making this up. The food stamps was not who was buying food stamps, it was what is it being spent on. SOPA was not prying into who's on the internet. It was to stop online piracy, because we have so much of that today. And the NSA, no, I don't support anything of snooping into someone's records without a warrant.
Thank you, thank you. Well, we've reached the end of the debate portion of this program, and now we move to the closing remarks. And with the closing remarks, they begin with Congressman Marino.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, here's what we know. We know that I work for my constituents to improve the quality of their lives. We know that I worked on the Susquehanna Valley Thruway construction that will start next year according to the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation. It will create thousands of jobs. It will stimulate the economy, and it will make it safer. As I said, I opened the Veterans Clinic in Wayne County. My legislation for the RAPID Act does away with red tape, so again, thousands of jobs can be created. Remember, 20 million people are out of work. I reached across the aisle on the other side as long as they meet me halfway. I passed we're working on legislation with the most liberal person on the Democrat side on protecting women that have been raped. I went to Congress to fix problems, and I'm working on fixing those problems, and I'm going to continue to work on those problems. Here, my opponents do not want you to know that. They voted for Obama. They supported the disaster of Obamacare. They support amnesty for illegal immigrants. They support out-of-control spending, and they support gun control. I was entrusted to vote to downsize to the federal government and to keep taxes low, to create jobs, and I'm keeping my promise. I will keep fighting for term limits, 12 years and you're out, one subject at a time so you know what we're voting on, and stand up to leadership from both sides of the aisle. When Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama or John Boehner get it wrong, I'm going to be standing right there challenging them. I know who I work for. I work for you. I will stand up to anyone and any policy that deviates from what we want here in the 10th Congressional District. We need toughness in D.C. I told you, my father was the toughest man I know. That's where I get my toughness, and I'll continue working hard for you. I need your vote next week, and I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marino. Mr. Brion.
Yeah, thank you. I guess in closing, I'd like to come back to and talk about liberty. For me, politics are personal. it's really how does the federal government impact our lives, both positively and negatively? How does it affect our family, our friends, our neighbors? And that really comes back to, a lot of issues. Number one, the economy. It talks about education, veterans. I tried to talk a little bit about seniors. And I really believe that we need a representative who, I was trying to do a quick count here. I think we've got 12, maybe 13 references to the President, Nancy Pelosi, or Harry Reid. And I'm sorry, I added in John Boehner. We had one of those. And so rather than focusing on the leadership and fighting against something, we need a representative who fights for something. And fights, that something needs to be for us. Fights for rural Pennsylvania. Goes out and, if I mention to him that, hey, there's a neighbor of his that has to drive 4 hours to a clinic in Wilkes-Barre, the answer shouldn't be, well, I've taken credit for a new hospital, which is actually a clinic in Wayne County, which was actually worked on by Chris Carney, his predecessor, who got it started. We really need somebody who moves forward, who gives us answers, who tells us what we can do to make the federal government work better for us. And that's the kind of congressman that I would like to be, and I will pledge to you to always keep the interests of the 10th District, its citizens, first, because I think that's what we really deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brion. And Mr. Troiano.
Well, thanks again to WVIA and to those who've taken the time to tune in. Our country is clearly at a crossroads. We face enormous issues, yet find ourselves with a Congress that's both gridlocked and corrupt because we have not held our leaders accountable. Congress has an 8% approval rating, yet 90% of members get reelected. It sure is working out well for the politicians, but not for we the people. Not for the farmers in Bradford County I met with who are struggling to make ends meet. Not for the family in Union County I sat down with who still can't afford health care insurance. Not for the father in Northumberland County who lost his job, now works 2 part-time jobs for half the pay. I think it's time to wake up and to realize that politicians, like my opponent, who tell us that the system is broken, but somehow they're not part of the problem, are playing us for fools. Because, ladies and gentlemen, Tom Marino isn't just part of the problem in Washington, he is the definition of it. Now, the good news is, in this election, you'll have a real choice. If you want to send just another congressman to Washington, well, you can vote for either of my opponents. But if you want to send a true representative, someone who can represent you and not their party or their special interest contributors, then I humbly ask for your vote on November 4th. And if I'm elected, I will work my hardest with both parties to reduce our debt, grow our economy, and get our country energy independent so that our future can be brighter than our past. And I know we can win this election because I've seen how far our campaign has already come. More than 7,000 people signed petitions to get my name on the ballot. More individuals contributed to my campaign in the last quarter than either of my opponents. And we earned the endorsement of 22 mayors from both parties in 11 different counties. We've already done what the conventional wisdom said was impossible. Now I ask you to join us on November 4th to prove that America deserves better than politics as usual. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. And there you have it. That concludes this debate between the candidates for the 10th Congressional District seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Thanks to Mr. Brion, Mr. Marino, and Mr. Troiano for participating, and thanks to our panel. Tomorrow at 7, our series concludes with a debate between the candidates for the 17th Congressional District. Next Tuesday's Election Day, and make sure you get out and vote. I'm Larry Voitko. Thanks for watching, and good night.